He is the serial killer who murdered 93 people. Samuel Little holds the horrifying distinction of being America's most prolific serial killer in history, confessing to strangling 93 women across the United States over nearly 4 decades. And the most chilling part? He remembered every single one of them. But before we dive into the darkness of his crimes, let me tell you something that will make your skin crawl. Samuel Little didn't just kill. He was an artist. A portrait artist, to be precise. And in his final years, locked behind bars, he drew his victims. One by one. Sketches so detailed, so accurate, that investigators used them to identify women who had been missing for decades. Women whose families never knew what happened to them. Women whose murders had gone cold, forgotten by everyone, except the man who stole their last breath. This is the story of America's deadliest serial killer. A man who hunted in the shadows for 40 years, preying on society's most vulnerable, believing he would never be caught. Samuel Little was born Samuel McDowell on June 7, 1940, in Reynolds, Georgia. His childhood was turbulent from the start. Raised primarily by his grandmother in Lorain, Ohio, after his mother abandoned him, Little grew up in an environment of instability and neglect. By his teens, he had already developed a pattern that would define his entire life: alcohol abuse, petty theft, and an early fascination with violence against women. He dropped out of high school and began drifting across America, supporting himself through shoplifting, fraud, and breaking into homes. But theft wasn't his only crime. As early as 1956, when he was just 16 years old, Little was arrested for burglary. What the arresting officers didn't know was that this was just the beginning of a criminal career that would span decades and claim nearly 100 lives. Little was a boxer in his youth, fighting in small-time matches. His powerful hands, trained to deliver devastating punches, would later become instruments of death. But he didn't punch his victims to death. No, Samuel Little had a very specific method. He strangled them. And he did it in a way that often left no obvious signs of homicide. Throughout the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, Little moved constantly. California, Florida, Ohio, Kentucky, Louisiana, Georgia, Mississippi, Tennessee, Texas. He was everywhere and nowhere, a ghost drifting through America's cities, leaving a trail of bodies that investigators wouldn't connect for decades. He targeted women on the margins of society: sex workers, drug addicts, homeless women, those struggling with poverty, women he believed no one would miss, women he thought no one cared about. And for a long time, he was right. Let me tell you about one of his first confirmed murders. The year was 1970. The victim was Mary Jo Brosley, a 33-year-old woman in Miami, Florida. Little strangled her in her own home, leaving her body to be discovered by neighbors. But here's what's terrifying. Investigators at the time didn't classify it as a homicide. They thought she had died of natural causes or an overdose. This became Little's signature advantage. His method of strangulation was so precise, so calculated, that it often mimicked natural death, especially in victims who had pre-existing health conditions or substance abuse issues. In 1976, Little was back in Florida, this time in the town of Homestead. He encountered Patricia Ann Parker, a 23-year-old woman. He convinced her to get into his car, drove her to an isolated area, and strangled her until she stopped breathing. He dumped her body in a grove, where it would be found days later. Again, investigators struggled to determine the cause of death definitively. Again, Little walked free. But Little wasn't always so careful. In 1982, he was arrested and charged with the murders of 2 women in Pascagoula, Mississippi, Melinda Rose Laprie and Patricia Ann Mount. Both women had been strangled. Both had been found in wooded areas. The evidence against Little was substantial. He was indicted and went to trial. But then something happened that would allow him to continue killing for another 2 decades. The case fell apart. Key witnesses failed to appear in court. Evidence was mishandled. Little walked out of that courtroom a free man, despite the fact that investigators were certain he was guilty. It was a catastrophic failure of the justice system, one that would cost many more women their lives. Emboldened by his acquittal, Little continued his killing spree with renewed confidence. He moved to Los Angeles, a sprawling city with a large population of vulnerable women living on its streets. From 1987 to 1994, Los Angeles became his primary hunting ground. One of his victims during this period was Audrey Nelson, a 35-year-old woman he picked up in August 1989. Little drove her to an alley in the Watts neighborhood, strangled her, and dumped her body behind a dumpster. Her murder went unsolved for decades. Another victim was Guadalupe Apodaca, a 46-year-old woman whose partially clothed body was found in an alley in September 1984. Little had strangled her with such force that he fractured the bones in her neck. But even with this evidence, her death remained a mystery for years. What made Little so successful as a killer wasn't just his method, it was his choice of victims. He specifically targeted women who were estranged from their families, women whose disappearances might not be immediately reported, women whose deaths might not be thoroughly investigated. In the 1970s and 80s, law enforcement resources for investigating the deaths of sex workers and drug addicts were minimal. These were considered misdemeanor murders by some departments, cases that didn't receive the same attention as the deaths of women from more affluent backgrounds. Little knew this. He exploited it ruthlessly. In 1994, Little was finally arrested again, this time for the kidnapping and attempted rape of a woman in San Diego. This time, the charges stuck. He was sentenced to 50 months in prison. But even behind bars, even registered as a sex offender, the murders already committed remained unsolved. Investigators had no idea they had one of America's deadliest serial killers in custody. After his release in the late 1990s, Little continued to kill. In 2004, he picked up a woman in Huntington Park, California, strangled her, and left her body in an alley. In 2005, he murdered another woman in Blythe, California. These would be his final known victims. By 2012, Little's health was declining, and his transient lifestyle had finally caught up with him. He was living in a homeless shelter in Louisville, Kentucky when he was arrested on a narcotics charge. Because he was a registered sex offender, his DNA was entered into the national database, and that's when everything changed. The DNA match came back like a thunderbolt. Little's DNA matched evidence from 3 unsolved murders in Los Angeles: the deaths of Carol Alford in 1987, Audrey Nelson in 1989, and Guadalupe Apodaca in 1984. These were cold cases that had languished in filing cabinets for decades. Suddenly, they were very hot. Little was extradited to California and charged with 3 counts of murder. The trial began in 2013, and the evidence was overwhelming. Survivors of Little's attacks testified about his method, the way he would gain their trust, the sudden violence, the powerful hands around their throats. DNA evidence placed him at the crime scenes. In September 2014, Samuel Little was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. But the story doesn't end there. In fact, it was only beginning. While in prison, Little caught the attention of James Holland, a Texas Ranger with a reputation for getting confessions from cold case killers. Holland had a different approach than most investigators. He didn't interrogate, he listened. He built rapport. He treated suspects like human beings, even monsters like Samuel Little. And Samuel Little wanted to talk. Over the course of hundreds of hours of interviews, Little began to confess. 1 murder, then 5, then 20, then 50. The confessions kept coming, each one more detailed than the last. Little would close his eyes and describe his victims with eerie precision: what they wore, how they styled their hair, the sound of their voices, the locations where he killed them. He remembered the most intimate details of murders committed 40 years earlier, crimes that police departments across the country had long since given up on solving. But here's what makes it even more disturbing. Little was an artist, and Holland encouraged him to draw. Little began sketching portraits of his victims from memory. Women with short curly hair and bright eyes, women with long braids and gentle smiles, women whose faces had been forgotten by everyone except the man who killed them. These sketches were released to the public by the FBI, and one by one, families began to recognize their loved ones. Cold cases were reopened. Bodies were exhumed. Missing persons reports from the 1970s and 80s were re-examined. The sketches were so accurate, that they led to the identification of multiple victims who had been buried as Jane Does for decades. By 2018, the FBI announced that Samuel Little had confessed to 93 murders, making him the most prolific serial killer in American history, surpassing even Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, and Gary Ridgway, the Green River Killer. 93 women, 93 daughters, mothers, sisters, friends. 93 lives stolen over nearly 4 decades. Let me tell you about some of them. Not just the statistics, but the women themselves. There was Rose Evans, a homeless woman Little picked up in Macon, Georgia in 1982. She had struggled with addiction but was trying to get her life back on track. Little strangled her and threw her body into a wooded area. For 37 years, her family didn't know what happened to her. There was Denise Christie Brothers, a 29-year-old woman from Odessa, Texas. In 1994, Little encountered her at a convenience store, convinced her to go with him, and murdered her in his car. Her body was found in a field, but the case went cold until Little's confession decades later. There was Patricia Parker, just 23 years old, killed in Homestead, Florida in 1976. She had her whole life ahead of her. Little took it away in a matter of minutes, and these are just 3 of 93. Each one had a story. Each one had dreams and fears and people who loved them. Each one deserved justice. Samuel Little's victims spanned across at least 14 states: California, Texas, Florida, Georgia, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, Ohio, Nevada, Arkansas, Kansas, Tennessee, and more. Some were never found. Some were buried without names. Some were cremated as Jane Does, their ashes scattered, their identities lost forever. Little operated with near impunity for so long because of several factors. First, his choice of victims. Second, his method of killing, which often didn't leave obvious signs of homicide. Third, the lack of communication between law enforcement agencies in different states. In the 1970s and 80s, there was no national database for tracking serial murders. A killing in California wouldn't be connected to a killing in Ohio. Little exploited these gaps in the system. But there's another, darker reason. Little got away with it for so long. Society didn't value his victims the way it should have. These were women living on the streets, struggling with addiction, selling their bodies to survive. When they disappeared, investigations were often perfunctory. When their bodies were found, resources weren't always dedicated to solving their murders. This is what's known as the, quote, less dead, a term used by investigators to describe victims whose deaths don't generate the same public outcry or investigative effort as others. Samuel Little knew this. He said as much in his confessions. He chose his victims specifically because he believed no one would come looking for them. And for decades, he was right. On December 30th, 2020, Samuel Little died in a California hospital at the age of 80. He was serving multiple life sentences and would have never been released. But even in death, his legacy of horror continues to unfold. Investigators are still working to verify his confessions, still trying to match his sketches to missing persons cases, still trying to give names back to the nameless. As of now, law enforcement has confirmed over 60 of Little's confessed murders. The remaining cases are being investigated, hampered by the passage of time, lost evidence, and the deaths of potential witnesses. Some of these murders may never be fully confirmed. Some of his victims may never be identified. But the work continues, because every victim deserves justice. Every family deserves answers. Every woman Samuel Little murdered deserves to be remembered as more than just a number in his gruesome tally. The story of Samuel Little is a story about the darkest capabilities of human nature. But it's also a story about systemic failure, about how society's most vulnerable people can slip through the cracks, can disappear without anyone noticing, can die without anyone caring enough to demand answers. What's perhaps most chilling about Samuel Little's confessions is the pleasure he took in remembering. When Texas Ranger James Holland interviewed him, Little would smile as he recalled the details. He would describe the moment of the kill with a kind of reverence, talking about the way his victims' eyes would change, the way their bodies would go limp in his hands. He felt no remorse. He felt satisfaction. Little told investigators that he strangled his victims slowly, often during or after sexual acts. He enjoyed the power, the control, the feeling of a life ending beneath his fingers. Some victims fought back, some begged, some tried to reason with him. It didn't matter. Once Samuel Little decided you were going to die, there was no escape. In one particularly disturbing confession, Little described killing a woman in Cincinnati, Ohio, in the early 1980s. He said he picked her up near downtown, promised her money, and drove her to a secluded area. As he began to strangle her, she fought hard, scratching at his face and arms. He had to use all his strength to overpower her. When it was over, he dumped her body in a ravine and drove away. He never learned her name. To him, she was just another victim, another conquest. This callousness, this complete lack of empathy, is what allowed Little to kill so many. He didn't see his victims as human beings. They were objects, opportunities, means to satisfy his dark urges. The FBI and local law enforcement agencies across the country continue to work on the Samuel Little case. His confessions have led to the reopening of hundreds of cold cases. Families who spent decades wondering what happened to their loved ones are finally getting answers, though those answers bring both closure and renewed grief. Some of Little's sketches remain unidentified. These drawings show women with distinctive features: a gap-toothed smile, a particular hairstyle, a unique piece of jewelry. The FBI has released these images to the public, hoping someone will recognize a missing mother, sister, daughter, or friend. Each unidentified sketch represents a woman whose murder may never be fully solved, whose family may never know the truth. The investigation into Samuel Little's crimes has revealed uncomfortable truths about the American criminal justice system. How did one man kill 93 people without being stopped? How did so many murders go unsolved for so long? The answer lies in a combination of factors: jurisdictional boundaries that prevented agencies from sharing information, limited resources dedicated to investigating crimes against marginalized women, forensic limitations of earlier decades, and Little's own cunning in choosing victims and locations. But perhaps the most important lesson from the Samuel Little case is this: every life matters. Every victim deserves justice. Every missing person deserves to be searched for. Every unsolved murder deserves investigation, regardless of who the victim was or how they lived. Samuel Little murdered 93 people. He did it over 4 decades. He did it in plain sight. He thought he would be forgotten, another nameless criminal dying in prison. But he was wrong. His victims will be remembered. Their stories will be told. And the system that failed them is being forced to reckon with that failure. That is the true horror of this story. And that is why it must be told.